He expected a black-edged letter informing him of her death. It was, after all, the most logical conclusion to the transaction. He had purchased a sickly bride from a bankrupt merchant, a placeholder duchess to satisfy the barest requirements of his title, and deposited her in a tomb of an estate to quietly expire. He did not expect to return a year later, broken by politics and war, to find the tomb resurrected. He did not expect repaired gates and warm chimneys. He did not expect the woman he had abandoned to the rot to be standing in the heart of his reclaimed home, not as a ghost, but as its queen, having doubled the estate's fortunes through sheer, inconvenient will. And he certainly did not expect that her survival would become the one thing he could not live without. The solicitor's office in London was a box of desiccated air and the scent of dying paper. Alastair, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, felt the dust of forgotten legal precedents settle on his shoulders, a weight indistinguishable from the exhaustion that had become his constant companion for the last 5 years. He stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the gray, indifferent procession of carriages on the street below, his mind 1,000 miles away, charting troop movements on a map of a country he had bled for and now despised. The war was over, but the battles continued, fought now in drawing rooms and parliamentary chambers, with whispers and ink instead of cannon and steel. It was a filthier, more draining kind of warfare. Behind him, a dry cough, delicate as a falling leaf, broke the silence. He did not turn. It was the 3rd time the girl had coughed in the last 10 minutes. A weak constitution, her father had admitted with a merchant's grim pragmatism, as if listing the minor flaws in a bolt of cloth. Alastair had not cared. Frailty was, in this instance, a feature, not a bug. He required a duchess. The title demanded it. The endless parade of hopeful mothers and their simpering daughters at every London event was a drain on his already depleted reserves of patience, and his distant cousins were circling his entailed properties like vultures. He needed a wife, but he did not want one. He did not want the chatter, the social obligations, the cloying intimacy, the expectation of an heir. He wanted a name on a piece of paper, a body to fill a legal void, and then he wanted silence. Mr. Vance, the girl's father, had been a perfect solution. A shipping merchant of some renown, he had overextended his credit, gambled on a venture that had foundered on the rocks of the blockade, and now faced ruin. He also, it turned out, owed a significant and long-forgotten debt to the Blackwood estate, a note signed by his grandfather 2 generations ago. Alastair's solicitors, meticulous creatures of habit, had unearthed it. It gave the Duke leverage. Mr. Vance had a single, unmarried daughter. Alastair had a proposition. The debt would be forgiven, and a handsome sum settled upon Mr. Vance to salvage his business in exchange for the girl's hand. It was a clean, cold transaction. A life for a life. A daughter for a dukedom. If your grace would be so kind as to attend to the final signature, the solicitor, Mr. Pembroke, murmured. His voice was oiled with a deference that bordered on reptilian. Alastair turned from the window. The room was small, paneled in dark wood that swallowed the weak afternoon light. Pembroke sat behind a vast desk cluttered with neat stacks of documents. Before the desk, on 2 stiff-backed chairs, sat the Vances. The father was a portly man, his face florid with a mixture of sweat and humiliation. He clutched his hat in his hands, his knuckles white. He refused to meet the Duke's eyes. And then there was the girl. Ilara. He thought that was her name. She sat perfectly still, her back ramrod straight, a stark contrast to her father's slumped posture. She was pale, her skin having the translucent quality of fine porcelain, making the faint blue veins at her temples visible. Her hair, a simple brown, was pulled back severely, and her dress was a sober gray, clean but clearly not new. She was not a beauty in the London society sense. There was no rosy bloom to her cheeks, no flirtatious curl to her lips. Her face was all sharp angles and intelligence, dominated by a pair of eyes so lucid and gray they seemed to drink in the light and give nothing back. They were watching him now, not with fear or awe, but with a flat, unnerving appraisal. He felt a flicker of annoyance. He had expected tears, or, at the very least, a maidenly swoon. He was being handed a death sentence, after all, or at least a life sentence of gilded irrelevance. Yet, she looked at him as if he were a column of figures in a ledger she was about to audit. He moved to the desk, the sound of his boots unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He ignored the chair Pembroke gestured to and remained standing, looming over them all. It was a power he was accustomed to, the simple physics of his height and breadth, and he used it without thought. He picked up the pen. The marriage contract was a thick vellum, dense with clauses and subclauses designed to protect the Blackwood title and lands from any possible claim. It was an instrument of binding, but also of erasure. She would become the Duchess of Blackwood, but she would cease, in any meaningful way, to be Elara Vance. His gaze fell upon her signature, already there at the bottom of the page. The script was neat, precise, and utterly devoid of flourish. It was the handwriting of a clerk, not a lady of leisure. He signed his own name above hers, Alastair St. John, Blackwood, a swift, jagged slash of ink. Done. The transaction was complete. He straightened, placing the pen back in its stand with a decisive click. "The carriage will be ready in an hour," he said, his voice a low rasp from disuse. He did not address Elara directly, instead directing his words to the space between her and her father. "We travel north at once." Mr. Vance flinched. "At once, Your Grace." "But her things her mother passed only last year. She might wish to—" "She will require nothing from this life," Alastair stated, the words falling like stones into the stuffy air. "Everything she needs will be provided." It was not a kindness. It was a statement of ownership. He turned to leave, his duty done, his mind already moving on to the more pressing matter of a proposed trade tariff he needed to quash in the House of Lords. He wanted to be out of this room, out of this city, back in the familiar arena of political combat. "Your Grace." The voice was quiet, but it cut through his thoughts like a shard of glass. It was hers. He paused at the door, his hand on the brass knob, but did not turn. "You have purchased a duchess," Elara Vance said, her tone level, almost conversational. "But it is Blackwood Manor you are sending me to, is it not? The seat in Northumberland." Alastair remained silent. Pembroke shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I have read of it," she continued, and for the first time there was a faint, dry irony in her voice. "The northern jewel of the Blackwood holdings. Though I believe the last duke to reside there was your great-grandfather. The reports say it has been unoccupied for 50 years. He finally turned, his eyes narrowing. She was still looking at him with that unnerving, analytical gaze. She knew. Of course she knew. A merchant's daughter would have done her research. She would have assessed the value of the asset she was being traded for. "The estate is rustic," he allowed, the word a deliberate understatement. He had not seen it since he was a boy, but he remembered the stories. A place of damp stone, perpetual rain, and isolation. A place to be forgotten. A perfect place. "So I understand," she said. Another delicate, racking cough shook her small frame. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips, and when she pulled it away, she folded it quickly, but not before Alastair caught the faint, dark stain against the white linen. His jaw tightened. This was better than he could have hoped. The damp Northumberland air would finish what London smog had started. It would be quick. It would be quiet. "It will suffice," he said, the words of final dismissal. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the scent of dust and desperation behind him. He did not look back. He had concluded his business. He had acquired a duchess, a temporary inconvenience who would soon become a permanent and blessedly silent memory. The carriage ride north was a study in miserable silence. It lasted 4 days, a journey through a landscape that seemed to bleed color with every mile, shifting from the grimy vibrancy of London to the muted greens and browns of the Midlands, and finally to the stark, bruised purples and grays of the northern fells. The rain began on the second day, a persistent, weeping drizzle that turned the roads to liquid mud and beaded on the carriage windows, blurring the world into a watercolor of decay. Inside, the atmosphere was as cold and damp as the weather outside. Alistair had taken the forward-facing seat, stretching his long legs out and effectively claiming 2/3 of the small space. He had not spoken a word to her since they had left the solicitor's office, save for a few curt commands to the driver. He spent his hours staring out the window or reviewing documents from a leather satchel, his face a mask of grim concentration. He seemed entirely unaware of her presence, or perhaps he was simply masterful at ignoring it. Alara sat opposite him, bundled in a thick wool travel cloak that smelled of camphor and disuse. It was one of the few items her father had pressed into her hands during the frantic, whispered farewell at the coaching inn, his face a miserable portrait of guilt. "For the cold, my dear. It gets cold." Up there, her own trunk, containing a pathetic collection of mended dresses and a few precious books, was strapped to the roof, exposed to the relentless rain. She imagined her belongings, like her future, slowly being saturated with damp until they simply fell apart. She did not try to speak to him. What was there to say? He was not her husband. He was her proprietor. He had purchased her to solve a problem, and now he was moving his acquisition to a storage facility. To speak would be to acknowledge a relationship that did not exist, a humanity he had shown no interest in recognizing. So she remained silent, her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect despite the lurching and swaying of the carriage. She watched him. She conceded with the detached part of her mind that had always loved puzzles, a magnificent ruin of a man. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps only 30, but he carried himself with the weariness of someone much older. His face, which in another life might have been handsome, was all harsh lines and sharp angles, as if carved from granite. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a perpetually forbidding expression. When he slept, which he did for brief, restless intervals, his hands would clench into fists and his jaw would grind, as if fighting a battle in his dreams. He was a man hollowed out by duty, a shell packed with trauma and responsibility. Alara, daughter of a man who understood the cold calculus of profit and loss, recognized a terrible sort of balance sheet in the Duke's face. He had paid a great price for whatever victories he had won. On the fourth day, the landscape changed again. The rolling hills gave way to vast, empty moorland, a desolate expanse of heather and gorse under a sky the color of a lead plate. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying the scent of wet peat and stone. They had been climbing for hours, the horses straining against the incline. Finally, the carriage crested a ridge and began its descent into a long, narrow valley. "We are here," Alistair said, his first words in 2 days. He did not look at her. He was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. Alara followed his gaze. At the bottom of the valley, shrouded in mist and rain, was the house. Blackwood Manor. Her first thought was not that it was a house, but a geological feature. It seemed to grow out of the dark, wet earth, a sprawling mass of blackened stone and slate, more fortress than home. It was vast, a chaotic jumble of wings and towers built and abandoned over centuries. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, choked the walls, its dark leaves slick with rain. Many of the windows were boarded up. Others were dark, empty sockets that stared out blindly at the desolate landscape. A single turret, leaning at a precarious angle, looked like a rotting tooth against the gray sky. No smoke rose from any of its dozens of chimneys. The place did not look unoccupied. It looked dead. "The Northern Jewel," she murmured to herself, the irony so bitter it felt like acid in her throat. The carriage rumbled over a stone bridge, the river below a churning, brown torrent, and passed through a set of immense, wrought iron gates that hung askew on their hinges, half swallowed by rust and weeds. The drive was a tunnel carved through a forest of skeletal, overgrown trees, their branches clawing at the carriage roof. The sound was like fingernails scraping on a coffin lid. They finally lurched to a halt on a graveled sweep before the main entrance. The massive oak doors were closed. The place was utterly silent, save for the drumming of the rain and the heavy breathing of the exhausted horses. For a long moment, nothing happened. Alistair sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the house. Alara wondered if he was regretting his decision, if even he was appalled by the sheer, magnificent decay of the place he had chosen for her tomb. Then, with a sigh that was pure, undiluted weariness, he moved. He unlatched the carriage door and stepped out into the mud and the rain. He did not offer her a hand. He did not even look back. The driver, a grim-faced man who had not spoken the entire journey, unstrapped her lone trunk and dumped it on the wet gravel with a thud. Alara gathered her cloak and her courage and followed the Duke out of the carriage. The cold hit her instantly, a damp, penetrating chill that seemed to seep straight into her bones. The air smelled of mildew, of wet stone, of 100 years of neglect. She stood beside her trunk, a small, solitary figure in the vast, intimidating shadow of the house. Alistair was giving orders to the driver. Fresh horses from the village. Be ready to leave in an hour. He was not staying. The thought was not a surprise, but it landed with a cold finality. This was not a homecoming. It was a delivery. The great front doors creaked open, and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the gloom within. It was a woman, tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine that seemed to absorb what little light there was. Her gray hair was pulled into a bun, so tight it looked painful. She held a single, flickering candle that did little to dispel the darkness. "Your Grace," the woman said, her voice as brittle as dry leaves. "We were not expecting you." There was no welcome in her tone, only a flat statement of fact, layered with what sounded like disapproval. "Mrs. Croft," Alistair acknowledged with a curt nod. "This is the Duchess. See that she is made comfortable." The word comfortable sounded absurd in this setting. He turned and, for the first time, looked directly at Alara. His eyes were devoid of any emotion. They were simply gray, like the sky, like the stone, like the future he had planned for her. "I have business in London," he said. The statement was an explanation and a dismissal all in one. "The running of this house is now your concern. You may do as you please. Draw on the estate accounts as you see fit. I will not be returning for some time." He paused, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to the damp ground between them. Perhaps never. It was, Alara realized, the kindest thing he could say. He was giving her permission to die without inconveniencing him. He was telling her that her failure was not only expected, but required. "I see," she said, her own voice sounding small and thin in the vast, wet emptiness. She would not give him the satisfaction of pleading or of weeping. She was a merchant's daughter. She understood the terms of contract. She had been sold, and now she had been delivered. She lifted her chin, meeting his indifferent gaze. "Thank you for the clarification, Your Grace." For a fleeting moment, something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance? Surprise? Or perhaps it was just a trick of the rain. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if acknowledging the conclusion of their business. Then he turned, his long coat swirling around his boots, and walked back towards the waiting carriage without a second glance. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. He climbed inside, pulled the door shut, and a moment later, the carriage lurched into motion, its wheels spitting gravel and mud. Alara stood alone in the rain, her small trunk at her feet, and watched it disappear into the tunnel of skeletal trees. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. She was a mistress of this great, rotting house, and she had just been utterly, completely, and irrevocably abandoned. The cold seeped deeper in her bones, and for the first time, a genuine, terrifying despair threatened to swallow her whole. Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, regarded her with an expression that fell somewhere between pity and contempt. "The Duke has instructed that you be given the Duchess's suite," she announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous, tomb-like entrance hall. The air inside was colder than it had been outside, thick with the smell of cold ash, damp stone, and something else, something acrid and ancient, like the slow decay of forgotten memories. Dust motes, thick as insects, danced in the single beam of light from her candle. "This way," the housekeeper commanded, turning without waiting for a reply. Her footsteps made no sound on the grimy marble floor. Alara, shivering, followed the flickering light, leaving her mud-stained trunk where it lay. The hall was a gallery of ghosts. The portraits lining the walls were shrouded in cobwebs, their gilded frames tarnished, the faces of Alistair's ancestors staring out from beneath a veil of grime with uniformly disapproving expressions. Suits of armor stood like silent, rusting sentinels, their metal pitted and dark. The Duchess's suite was in the west wing, a part of the house that felt not just neglected, but actively malevolent. The air grew progressively colder as they walked, and a visible mist curled around their feet. Mrs. Croft pushed open a heavy, warped door and gestured Alara inside. "The Sapphire Room," she said, the name a cruel joke. The room was immense, with a ceiling so high it was lost in shadow. A vast canopied bed dominated the space. Its blue silk hangings, once sapphire, now faded to a mottled, depressing gray and shredded in places as if by angry claws. A fine layer of greenish mildew coated the wall behind the bed, and the air was thick with its scent. A single tall window, its glass streaked with filth, looked out onto a sheer drop, the valley floor lost in the mist below. The fireplace was a gaping black mouth, filled with the sodden remains of a long-dead fire. "I will send a girl to light the fire and bring some water," Mrs. Croft said, her tone suggesting this was a great and unusual effort. "Dinner is at 8. If there is any—" She turned to leave. "Wait," Alara's voice was a croak. The chill in the room was a physical presence, a predator. She could feel it wrapping around her chest, tightening, making it hard to breathe. The familiar, dreaded tightness was beginning. "This room, is it the only one available?" Mrs. Croft turned back, a flicker of something, malicious satisfaction, perhaps, in her cold eyes. "It is the Duchess's suite. It has been prepared for you." It had been prepared like a grave. Alara knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that if she spent a single night in this room, she would not see the morning. The damp would invade her lungs, the cold would stop her heart, and she would become just another ghost in this house of shadows. This was the quiet expiration her husband had planned for. She sank onto the edge of a dusty, moth-eaten chaise longue, the fabric cold and clammy against her hand. The journey, the cold, the sheer, overwhelming despair of her situation had finally caught up with her. She began to cough, a deep, racking cough that started in her toes and tore through her body. It went on, a terrible, helpless spasm. She felt a wave of dizziness, and the room, with its shadows and its mildew, began to spin. She was going to die here, in this cold, hateful room, alone and forgotten. The thought was not dramatic. It was a simple, pragmatic assessment of the facts. For 3 days, Alara drifted in a feverish twilight. She was vaguely aware of being moved to the great, canopied bed, the sheets feeling like shrouds of ice against her burning skin. Faces swam in and out of her vision, a young, terrified maid with wide eyes, and the severe, impassive face of Mrs. Croft, who would appear periodically to force a spoonful of bitter broth or foul-tasting medicine between her lips. The house itself seemed to be a living participant in her illness. The wind howled in the chimney like a hungry wolf. Rain lashed against the filthy window pane, and the damp seemed to rise from the very floorboards, a malevolent mist that clogged her throat and filled her lungs. She dreamed of her father, his face a mask of guilt, turning away from her. She dreamed of the Duke, his gray eyes cold and dismissive as he walked away without looking back. But mostly, she dreamed of drowning. Drowning in cold, muddy water, the weight of the great house pressing down on her, the faded sapphire hangings of the bed wrapping around her like seaweed, pulling her under into a silent, black oblivion. She was losing. The house, and the future her husband had chosen for her, were winning. On the 4th morning, she woke up, not just stirred, but truly woke up. The fever had broken, leaving her weak, drenched in sweat, but lucid. The room was cast in the weak, gray light of dawn. The rain had finally stopped, and an unnerving silence had fallen. In that silence, Alara heard the sound of her own breathing, a shallow, rasping wheeze. She was alive, but only just. She lay there, staring up at the tattered canopy above her, and a feeling began to kindle in the pit of her stomach. It was not hope. It was not courage. It was rage. A cold, clear, white-hot rage. They had left her here to die. The Duke, with his casual cruelty. Her father, with his weak-willed sacrifice. This house, with its insidious damp and its oppressive gloom. They had all written her off. They had looked at her, the sickly merchant's daughter, and seen nothing but a problem to be disposed of. She thought of her mother, a practical woman who had died not of illness, but of a broken heart after a series of financial blows. "Never let them see you beaten, Elara," she used to say, while teaching her daughter how to read a balance sheet. "The moment they think you are a victim, you become one." Elara was not a victim. She was a commodity that had been sold. She was an asset that had been relocated. And right now, she was a non-performing asset. Her new owner expected her to expire, to be written off the books. And she, in her weakness and despair, had been about to comply. No more. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like fire in her veins, she threw back the damp, heavy blankets. The air in the room was freezing, and her shift was soaked through, but she ignored it. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the bare, icy floorboards, and the shock of it traveled up her spine, a jolt of pure, agonizing life. She stood up, her legs trembling violently. She had to grab the bedpost to keep from falling. For a moment, the room swam, but she gritted her teeth and held on, her knuckles white. She would not fall. She would not be weak. She would not die. A young maid, the same terrified one from her fever dreams, entered the room carrying a pitcher of water. She stopped dead, her eyes wide with shock, and dropped the pitcher. It shattered on the floor, sending a spray of icy water across the boards. "Your Grace, you're out of bed." "Yes," Elara said, her voice a raw whisper. "I am." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air a painful balm on her ravaged lungs. She pointed a trembling finger at the mildew-stained wall. "This room is killing me." She looked at the terrified girl, whose name she did not even know. "I'm moving. Today. Now." The maid just stared, paralyzed. Elara pushed herself away from the bedpost and took a staggering step, then another. She was not a dying woman anymore. She was a living one, and a living woman had work to do. She made her way to the door, her hand brushing against the cold, damp silk of the bed hangings. With a sudden, vicious yank, she tore a long strip of the faded sapphire fabric from the canopy. It came away with a satisfying ripping sound. She walked out of the Duchess's suite, the tattered strip of silk clutched in her hand like a banner. She found Mrs. Croft in the main hall, overseeing two sullen servants who were half-heartedly sweeping dust from one corner to another. The housekeeper looked up, her expression of stern disapproval faltering into open astonishment as she saw Elara standing there, pale and trembling but undeniably upright, her eyes blazing with a fever that had nothing to do with illness. "Your Grace," Mrs. Croft began, recovering herself. "You should be in bed. You are not well." "I'm perfectly aware of my state of health." "Thank you, Mrs. Croft," Elara said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I'm also aware that the room you put me in is an uninhabitable, mildew-ridden death trap." She held up the strip of faded silk. "The Duchess's suite is to be closed and aired, and if it cannot be salvaged, it is to be stripped of its furnishings, and the door is to be locked permanently." She took another breath, feeling the power of her own voice, her own will, pushing back against the oppressive weight of the house. "From this moment on, I will not be treated as a guest who is expected to die quietly. I am the Duchess of Blackwood. This is my house, and I will not have it kill me." She looked from Mrs. Croft's stunned face to the two gaping servants. "Now," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she hadn't known she possessed. "One of you will find me a small, dry, defensible room near the kitchens. The other will bring me the household account ledgers for the past 5 years. I have work to do." The reclamation of Blackwood Manor began not with a grand gesture, but with a single, pragmatic decision. Elara chose a room for herself in the servants' wing, a small, square chamber directly above the main kitchen. It was intended for a senior cook or butler, long since departed. It was tiny, Spartan, and utterly lacking in ducal grandeur. It was also the warmest, driest room in the entire house. The constant heat rising from the kitchen hearths below kept the damp at bay and the chill from the stone walls. For the first time since her arrival, Elara slept through the night without shivering. The household ledgers, when they were finally located in a dusty, mouse-chewed chest, were a testament to decades of apathy and neglect. They were a chaotic mess of half-hearted entries, missing pages, and fanciful accounting. But to Elara, the merchant's daughter, they were a language she understood intimately. For days, she sat at a small wooden table in her new room, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a pot of ink at her elbow, and she read. She read of staggering expenditures on wine for a non-existent master, of wages paid to servants who were long dead or had departed years ago, of bills for repairs to wings of the house that were already collapsing into ruin. It was not just neglect. It was a slow, steady hemorrhage of funds, a financial death by 1,000 cuts. Her first act was to summon Mrs. Croft. The housekeeper arrived with her usual air of frosty disapproval, but there was a new, wary respect in her eyes. Elara did not stand on ceremony. She gestured to the open ledger on her table. "Mrs. Croft," she began, her tone crisp and businesslike. "According to this, we employ a staff of 27. "That is correct, Your Grace," the housekeeper replied stiffly. "And yet, I have seen perhaps 6 individuals since my arrival. Yourself, the girl Mary, 2 maids who seem to do nothing but stir dust, and the stable boy who brought my trunk." A faint flush crept up Mrs. Croft's neck. "Many of the staff live in the village. They are not always required." "I see," Elara said, tapping a long list of names with her finger. "So Thomas the footman, who apparently received a full salary last month, is not required? Nor are the 3 laundry maids, the under-butler, or the second gardener. Are they, in fact, still in the employ of this estate, or are they merely names on a page to whom you have been directing funds?" The flush on Mrs. Croft's neck deepened to a painful crimson. The woman was proud, and she had been running this ghost ship for a decade with no oversight. She had been skimming, not enough to be considered grand theft, but a steady, parasitic draining. Elara could have had her dismissed, thrown out into the mud. But she also recognized that Mrs. Croft, for all her faults, knew the house. She was a known quantity, and a good merchant knows when to renegotiate a contract rather than void it. "The accounts have been difficult to manage, Your Grace," the housekeeper mumbled, her gaze fixed on the floor. "They're about to become much simpler," Elara said calmly. "You will provide me with a list of the staff who are actually present and working. As of today, they are the only ones who will be paid. You will continue to receive your salary, Mrs. Croft, on the condition that from this day forward, every penny that passes through this household is accounted for. To me, is that understood?" It was a gamble. She was offering the woman a choice: join the new administration or be cast out with the old. For a long moment, Mrs. Croft stood rigid, her pride warring with her pragmatism. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she capitulated. "Yes, Your Grace." "Good," Elara said. "Now, I need to speak with the groundsman. A Mr. Finch, I believe." Mr. Finch was a man who seemed to have been grown from the very soil of Blackwood. He was gnarled and weathered, with hands like knotted roots and a face that was a road map of northern seasons. He smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and quiet competence. Elara found him not in a shed, but in the vast, derelict kitchen gardens, where he was patiently turning over a single, small patch of soil amidst a wilderness of weeds and brambles. He was, she realized, the only person who had been engaged in an act of creation, rather than simply presiding over decay. She did not summon him to the house. She went to him, picking her way through the mud in a pair of sturdy boots she had liberated from a forgotten closet. He watched her approach, his expression neutral, leaning on his spade. "Mr. Finch," she said, pulling her shawl tighter against the biting wind. "Your Grace," he acknowledged, his voice a low rumble. He did not bow, but touched his cap, a gesture of respect that felt more genuine than all of Mrs. Croft's stiff curtsies. "This garden," she said, gesturing to the overgrown chaos. "It once fed the entire household, I imagine." "Ah," he said, "and half the village. In the old Duke's time. I want to restore it," she said simply. "Not all of it, just a section. Enough for our needs. Potatoes, carrots, greens. Practical things. Things that will grow in this soil and this climate." Finch looked at her, his shrewd blue eyes taking in her pale face, her determined expression, the ink stain on her finger. He looked at the small, neat patch he had been working, and then back at the overwhelming wilderness. "It's a world of work, Your Grace. For little return, this time of year." "I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Finch," she said, "and I'm not asking you to do it alone." And so began the true work. Alara, the Duchess of Blackwood, traded her silk dresses for a simple linen smock. She spent her mornings in her small room, poring over the ledgers, her merchant's mind finding a fierce joy in the task of bringing order to chaos. She drafted letters to suppliers, canceling frivolous orders for French wine and silk ribbon. She wrote to the estate's tenants, many of whom had not paid rent in years, not with threats, but with practical proposals for payment in kind, a portion of their harvest, a number of sheep, a commitment of labor. She was creating a new economy, a closed system based not on distant gold, but on the real, tangible resources of Blackwood itself. In the afternoons, she went to the gardens. She worked alongside Finch, her hands, once soft and pale, becoming chapped and calloused. She learned the rhythm of the soil, the satisfaction of pulling a stubborn weed, the quiet hope of planting a seed. The young maid, Mary, seeing her Duchess on her knees in the mud, began to join her after her duties were done, bringing others with her. Soon, a small, determined team was working the earth, their shared labor a quiet act of rebellion against the decay that surrounded them. Her next great project was the house itself. It was too big, a wounded beast that was bleeding heat and resources from 100 different wounds. She couldn't save all of it, so she decided to amputate. Armed with a floor plan she had found in the library, she and Finch walked the vast, echoing corridors. They identified the core of the house, the kitchens, the servants' wing where they all now lived, the great hall for its magnificent and efficient fireplace, the library for its books, and a handful of adjacent rooms. Everything else, the entire West Wing with its haunted Duchess's suite, the dilapidated ballrooms, the endless succession of guest chambers in the East Wing, was to be closed off. Under Finch's direction, the few able-bodied men from the village who had answered her call for labor boarded up the doors to the abandoned wings. They stripped the rooms of anything useful, furniture that could be repaired and used or sold for timber, curtains that could be re-sewn into blankets, lead from the roofs of the most derelict sections, which she sold to a tinker for a surprising amount of coin. The house shrank, concentrating its life and warmth into a smaller, more defensible space. One cold afternoon, standing in the great hall, Alara watched as the final door to the West Wing was hammered shut. The incessant, ghostly draft that had plagued the hall was gone. For the first time, the heat from the roaring fire in the hearth actually filled the space, pushing back the chill. The house was breathing again. Slowly, miraculously, Blackwood began to transform. Smoke now billowed from the chimneys of the main block, a cheerful plume against the gray sky. The kitchen, under the resurrected authority of a grateful Mrs. Croft, was once again filled with the scent of baking bread and simmering stew, made with vegetables from their own garden. The staff, now a lean, efficient crew of 12, worked with a purpose they hadn't known in years. Their loyalty, which had once been a nebulous thing attached to a distant, abstract duke, was now given wholly and fiercely to the pale, determined woman who worked alongside them, who knew their names, and who had, against all odds, started to turn the tide. One evening, Alara sat at her desk, which was now the Duke's massive desk in the library, the only room large enough to hold all her papers. The fire crackled in the hearth, the scent of old paper and beeswax mingling with the faint aroma of the rosemary Finch grew in pots on the windowsill. She was reviewing the new set of accounts she had created. The columns were neat, the figures balanced. They were no longer bleeding money. In fact, through the sale of salvage materials, the leasing of some unused pasture land to a neighboring sheep farmer, and the collection of rents, they had turned a small, almost unbelievable profit. She looked around the room. The library, once shrouded in dust and neglect, was now clean. The books were organized, the wood polished. A bowl of late-blooming, hardy roses from the garden sat on the mantelpiece, a splash of defiant color against the dark wood. The house was no longer a tomb. It was not yet a palace, but it was becoming something far more valuable. It was becoming a fortress, a home, her home. She had arrived as a prisoner sentenced to die, but in the process of reclaiming this broken place, she had inadvertently reclaimed herself. She was no longer Alara Vance, the sickly merchant's daughter, nor was she simply the placeholder Duchess of Blackwood. She was the architect of this small, thriving kingdom, its ruler, its defender, and she had never felt more alive. Alistair returned on a Tuesday in late October, almost exactly a year after he had left. He came not in a grand ducal carriage, but on the back of a single, mud-splattered horse, riding it into the ground as if pursued by demons. And in a way, he was. The past year in London had been a brutal campaign. He had won his battles in Parliament, crushed his political rivals, and secured the interests of the crown, but the cost had been immense. The endless nights, the betrayals, the constant, grinding pressure had stripped him down to the bone. He was hollowed out, exhausted to his very soul, and haunted by the ghosts of men he had sent to their deaths, both on the battlefield and in the political arena. He was not returning to Blackwood to inspect his property. He was crawling back to it like a wounded animal seeking a dark, quiet hole in which to die. Or, if not to die, then to simply cease. To be left alone in the silent, rotting tomb he had so carefully chosen, where no one would bother him and no one would expect anything of him. He craved the silence, the decay, the absolute and final solitude of the place. The first sign that something was wrong came at the old stone bridge. The last time he had crossed it, it had been crumbling with a large, dangerous-looking hole in the center. Now the stonework was repaired, the gaps filled with fresh mortar. It was a small thing, but it was a note of order in the symphony of decay he had been anticipating. He spurred his horse onward, a flicker of irritation cutting through his exhaustion. Then he saw the gates. They were no longer hanging askew, swallowed by rust. They were upright, the rust scoured away and the iron treated with blacking. And they were closed, not locked but firmly shut. A thin curl of smoke rose from the small, formerly derelict gatehouse. As he approached, a boy of about 15 emerged, wiping his mouth. "Can I help you, sir?" the boy asked. There was no deference in his tone, just a straightforward question. He looked Alistair and his exhausted horse up and down. Alistair stared. "This is Blackwood Manor. I am the Duke of Blackwood." The words sounded hollow and absurd. The boy's eyes widened slightly, but he held his ground. "Her Grace is not expecting visitors," he said, the Her Grace spoken with a natural, proprietary air. "She's in the library with the accounts." Her Grace. For a moment, Alistair was genuinely confused. His mind cycled through the possibilities. Had his grandmother somehow risen from the grave? Then the memory, faint and inconvenient, surfaced. The pale girl, the cough, the marriage contract. Alara, the woman he had left here to die. The boy was looking at him, waiting. Alistair felt a surge of his old, imperious anger. "Open the gate." The boy, to his credit, did not flinch. He simply nodded, unlatched the heavy bar, and swung one of the massive gates open just wide enough for Alistair and his horse to pass through. Alistair rode through without a word, the boy's clear, curious gaze following him. The driveway was the next shock. The skeletal trees had been pruned, their grasping branches cut back to allow a wide, clear path. The verges were scythed. The sheer, oppressive wildness was gone, replaced by a managed, rustic order. As he rounded the final bend and the house came into view, he pulled his horse to a dead stop. It was the same house, but it was utterly transformed. The ivy had been stripped from the main block, revealing the clean, dark lines of the stone beneath. The boarded-up windows were still there in the distant wings, but the windows of the central section were clean, and behind several of them, a warm, yellow light glowed in the late afternoon gloom. And from four of the main chimneys, thick plumes of wood smoke rose, unfurling into the gray sky like banners of defiance. The house was not dead. It was breathing. It was alive. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he had taken a wrong turn and arrived at an entirely different estate. He had come here seeking a tomb, and he had found a home. It was not his home. He felt, with a sudden, jarring certainty, like an intruder. He dismounted, his legs stiff, and left his horse, reins trailing on the newly raked gravel. He walked to the great oak doors and, finding them unlocked, pushed them open and stepped inside. The entrance hall was not the cold, dark cavern he remembered. It was clean. A massive fire roared in the great hearth that had been cold for 50 years, its light glinting off the polished surfaces of the suits of armor. The floor was spotless, and a long runner of simple, woven will soften the echo of his footsteps. The air smelled not of mildew and decay, but of wood smoke, beeswax, and something else, rosemary. A woman in a crisp black dress and apron appeared from a corridor. It took him a moment to recognize Mrs. Croft. The severe, disapproving lines of her face had softened. She looked purposeful. "Your Grace," she said, and this time there was no mistaking the shock in her voice. She curtsied, a gesture that was automatic but flustered. Where is she?" Alistair's voice was a low growl. The exhaustion had been replaced by a sharp, agitated energy. He felt an unaccountable sense of fury. She had ruined his ruin. She had tidied up his tomb. Mrs. Croft, recovering her composure, drew herself up. "The Duchess is in the library, Your Grace. She is not to be disturbed before dinner." The proprietary tone, the casual assumption that this woman's schedule was the organizing principle of the house, grated on his nerves. He brushed past the housekeeper without another word and strode towards the library, his boots ringing on the stone floor. He threw open the heavy oak doors and stopped dead on the threshold. The scene before him was like a Dutch painting, a tableau of domestic industry. The room was bathed in the warm light of the fire and several strategically placed lamps. And at the center of it all, seated at his own massive desk, was her. She was not the pale, fragile girl he remembered. Her face was still pale, but it was no longer translucent. There was a vitality to her, a grounded strength. Her brown hair was still pulled back simply, but a few errant strands had escaped to curl around a face that was focused with fierce intelligence. She was wearing a simple, dark blue dress, its cuffs smudged with ink. Her hands, which he vaguely recalled as being delicate and white, were capable. They moved across the papers spread before her with an undeniable competence. She was magnificent. The thought came out of nowhere, and it infuriated him. She did not look up immediately. She finished the line of figures she was calculating, made a neat annotation in the margin, and then, as if sensing his presence, she slowly raised her head. Her gray eyes, as lucid and unnerving as he remembered, met his. There was no fear in them. No surprise. Only that same, cool, analytical appraisal. She had been expecting him. Not today, perhaps, but eventually. He stood there, a great, hulking figure of mud and rage, framed in the doorway of her world. The silence stretched, thick with a year of unspoken things. Finally, he spoke, the only words that could force their way past the knot of confusion and anger in his throat. "You are alive." Alara looked at the man, standing in the doorway of her library. He was larger than she remembered and dirtier. He filled the space, a disruptive whirlwind of mud, exhaustion, and simmering violence. His magnificent ruin of a face was now more ruin than magnificence, etched with new lines of weariness. He looked like a man who had lost a war, even if he had been declared the victor. Her first, uncharitable thought was that he was dripping mud all over her clean floor. "You are alive," he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated with a year's worth of neglect and surprise. She carefully placed her pen in its holder, giving herself a moment to arrange her thoughts as neatly as she arranged her columns of figures. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. She had imagined greeting him with a barrage of accusations, with a cold recitation of her accomplishments, with a display of wounded dignity. But seeing him now, so utterly undone by the simple fact of her continued existence, a dry, cynical humor took precedence. "An inconvenience I shall endeavor to continue, Your Grace," she replied, her voice calm and even. She did not rise. This was her desk. This was her room. He was the visitor here. He took a step into the room, and then another, his gaze sweeping around, taking in the clean surfaces, the organized books, the warm fire. He looked like a wolf circling a well-kept sheep pen, both baffled and enraged by the fence. His eyes came back to her, to the mountain of ledgers and papers on the desk. "What is all this?" he demanded, gesturing at her work with a sweep of his hand. "What have you done?" "I believe the term is estate management," she said, allowing a sliver of ice to enter her tone. "A concept that appears to have been unfamiliar to this household prior to my arrival. I have been balancing the books, arranging for repairs, and ensuring that your tenants do not starve or your house does not fall down. In short, I have been doing my duty as your Duchess. A role you assigned to me, if you recall." His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping in his cheek. "Your duty was to be quiet." The words were brutal, a stark admission of his original intent. "Ah, yes. The die quietly claws," she said, a bitter smile touching her lips for a fraction of a second. "I apologize for the oversight. My health, most inconveniently, improved. I find a northern air agrees with me, as does having a purpose." Section. He stared at her, genuinely speechless for a moment. He had expected a ghost, or at best, a resentful invalid. He had not expected this sharp-tongued, ink-stained stranger who sat in his chair as if she owned it, which he was beginning to realize in every way that mattered she did. "The staff," he began, grasping for some familiar foothold of authority. "Mrs. Croft said you were not to be disturbed. Mrs. Croft is an excellent housekeeper now that she is properly managed," Elara said smoothly. "She understands the importance of an uninterrupted workflow. We have established a system. It is very efficient." The implicit "we" hung in the air between them. "We, the people who actually live here and make this place run. And you, the landlord who appears once a year to drip mud on the floor." The power dynamic had shifted so completely it was dizzying. He was the Duke, he was the master of this house, and yet he felt like a subordinate being called into the head office for a dressing down. He stalked over to the fireplace, needing to move, to do something other than stand there being dismantled by her quiet composure. He rested one arm on the mantelpiece, his hand clenching into a fist. He was an intruder in his own home. Every clean surface, every balanced ledger, every plume of smoke from every chimney was a testament to her success and his neglect. "I came here for silence," he said, his voice low and raw, speaking more to the fire than to her. "For peace. You came here expecting a graveyard, Your Grace," she corrected him, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. She could see the profound exhaustion behind the anger. He was not just tired, he was broken. "I am sorry to disappoint you by presenting you with a functioning household instead." The sincerity in her apology, layered as it was with irony, seemed to wrong-foot him completely. He turned from the fire to look at her, a flicker of genuine confusion in his eyes. "Why?" he asked, the question blunt. "Why would you do all this? For a place like this? For me?" The last two words were spoken with a self-loathing that was startling. Elara considered the question. Why had she done it? It had started as a simple act of survival, a refusal to die, but had become something more. "I did not do it for you," she said, the honesty of it sharp and clean. "You left me here to rot. I did it for me. I did it because I am a merchant's daughter, and I cannot stand to see a valuable asset so poorly managed. I did it because I was cold, and I want to be warm. I did it because this house was dying, and I discovered I had no intention of dying with it. She rose from the desk, then, a deliberate movement that reclaimed the space around her. She walked over to the tall library window, which now looked out not on a black, terrifying void, but on the faint, orderly lights of the stable block in the gatehouse. "You gave me this ruin, Your Grace," she said, her back to him. "You told me to do as I pleased. I am pleased to have a roof that does not leak, a fire that keeps me warm, and enough food in the larder to see us through the winter. I have built a life here, a small, practical, solvent life." She turned back to face him, her gray eyes clear and direct. "The question is not why I have done this. The question is, what do you intend to do now? You are the Duke. This is nominally your house, but you are a stranger here. The staff take their orders from me. The tenants pay their rents to me. The ledgers are balanced by my hand. So what is your purpose here, Your Grace?" It was a declaration of war and an offer of terms all in one. She had laid out the map of her territory and dared him to challenge her claim. Alistair had no answer. He had spent his life giving orders, moving men like pieces on a chessboard, wielding his power and his title like a weapon. But here, in this room, his power was meaningless. His title was an empty word. He had been stripped of his authority not by force, but by sheer, undeniable competence. He was obsolete. The feeling was so foreign, so disorienting, that all he could do was stare at the magnificent, infuriating woman who had usurped him. The days that followed were a cold war fought in the corridors and rooms of Blackwood Manor. Alistair found himself a ghost in a house that was vibrantly alive. He would wake in the guest room he had been assigned, a small, clean, but pointedly insignificant chamber, to the sounds of a household already at work. The clatter of pots from the kitchen, the low murmur of voices, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. It was a world that ran on a schedule he did not set, and for a purpose he did not command. He was a duke without a domain. When he tried to give an order to a passing maid, she would curtsy, say, "Yes, Your Grace," and then immediately go to find the Duchess to ask for clarification. When he strode into the stables and attempted to requisition a horse, the stable master, a new man he didn't recognize, politely informed him that Her Grace had the horses scheduled for hauling timber that morning, but he would be happy to ready one for the Duke in the afternoon, if the Duchess approved. Every interaction was a subtle, maddening reminder of his irrelevance. He and Alara rarely spoke. They took their meals together in the small, formerly disused dining parlor she had reopened. The silence between them was immense, filled with unspoken resentments and challenges. He would watch her, this woman who was his wife in name only, as she ate her breakfast and reviewed a list of supplies with Mrs. Croft. She was always working, always planning. Her mind was a finely tuned machine, and the estate was its project. He tried to find fault. He spent a day riding the estate, seeking the neglect and decay he remembered. Instead, he found repaired fences, cleared ditches, and tenants who greeted him with a cautious respect that was clearly directed at the husband of the woman who had renegotiated their leases fairly and ensured their roofs were mended before winter. He returned to the house in the evening, angrier and more confused than ever. His past life, the world of London politics, seemed a distant, meaningless dream. Here, the concerns were immediate and tangible. The health of Sicu, the price of seed corn, the threat of an early frost. He, who had debated the fate of nations, felt utterly unequipped to contribute to a conversation about crop rotation. The storm began on a Friday night, a week after his arrival. It was not a gentle rain, but a raw, elemental fury, as if the wildness that Alara had beaten back from the estate had gathered its strength for a final assault. A savage wind tore at the house, shrieking around the corners and rattling the window panes. Rain came down in blinding, horizontal sheets, driven with the force of thrown gravel. They were in the library, as had become their custom after dinner. She was at the desk, working. He was in a wingback chair by the fire, pretending to read a book, But in reality, he was watching her, studying the way the firelight caught the curve of her neck as she bent over her work. The first great clap of thunder shook the house to its foundations. Alara looked up, a flicker of concern in her eyes. That was close. I hope the new slates on the east gable hold. Alistair said nothing. He was listening to the sound of the wind, and it was awakening something cold and terrible within him. The high-pitched shriek reminded him of something, the sound of incoming artillery. The drumming of the rain was like the relentless beat of a war drum. Another crash of thunder, louder this time, simultaneous with a flash of lightning that bleached the room white for a terrifying second. In that flash, the book Alistair was holding fell from his hands, landing on the floor with a soft thud. He was not in a library at Blackwood anymore. He was in a muddy trench outside a Spanish farmhouse. It was raining. It was always raining. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, blood, and wet wool. The man next to him, a young lieutenant named Price, was telling a stupid joke about a barmaid in Lisbon. Then came the whistle, the high, thin scream of an incoming shell. "Get down," he screamed, the words torn from his throat, a raw, useless command. Alara jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked over at him. He was no longer slumped in the chair. He was crouched beside it, his body coiled like a spring, his eyes wide and staring at something she could not see. His face, in the flickering firelight, was a mask of primal terror. "Your Grace?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. Alistair, he didn't hear her. He was lost. The library had dissolved around him. The polished wood floor was mud. The shelves of books were the crumbling walls of the farmhouse. The wind was the scream of dying men. "Price!" he yelled, his voice cracking with anguish. "Price, I'm sorry." He scrambled backwards, away from the fireplace, as if it were an exploding cannon. He collided with a small table, sending a lamp crashing to the floor. The oil spilled, but, mercifully, did not ignite. Alara's first instinct was fear. This was not the cold, arrogant Duke. This was a wild, dangerous stranger, trapped in a waking nightmare. Her mind raced. She could run, scream for help, but the staff were in their own wing, and the storm would swallow any sound. She was alone with him. But then, as another blast of thunder shook the house, she saw the sheer, unadulterated agony on his face, and her fear was eclipsed by a sudden, overwhelming wave of something else. Not pity, something more practical. She was looking at a machine that had broken, a system that had catastrophically failed. In her pragmatic mind, the mind that had balanced the ledgers and repaired the fences, immediately began to search for a solution. He was on the floor now, his hands over his ears, his body shaking uncontrollably. He was muttering names, a litany of the dead. He was drowning, not in water, but in memory. She had to anchor him. She had to pull him back to the present. Coddling him would be useless. She had to use facts, tangible, undeniable facts. She moved towards him slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Alistair," she said, her voice louder now, clearer, cutting through the noise of the storm and his own terror. She knelt, not too close, but within his line of sight. He flinched, his eyes finding her, but he looked straight through her. "The flank is collapsing. We need to pull back." "There is no flank," she said, her voice firm, authoritative. The voice she used with a stubborn tenant or a lazy supplier. "You are not in Spain. You are in Northumberland. You are at Blackwood Manor." "The rain," he gasped, his gaze darting towards the window. "The cannons." "It is not cannon fire. It is thunder," she stated, each word a solid, irrefutable brick. "The sound you hear is rain on the roof. The scent in the air is not gunpowder. It is spilled lamp oil and the beeswax I used on the floor this morning. Look at the floor, Alistair. It is oak. It is polished. It is not mud." She was giving him a litany of the mundane, a catechism of the present moment. She was fighting his ghost with facts. He blinked, his gaze wavering. He looked down at the floorboards beneath his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. His breathing was still ragged, a series of painful, tearing gasps. "My name is Alara," she continued, her voice steady, a lifeline in the chaos of his mind. You are my husband. We are in the library. The year is 1820. The war ended 5 years ago. You are safe. Safe. The word seemed to hang in the air between them. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. His eyes were still wide with a haunted darkness, but for the first time, there was a flicker of recognition in them. He was seeing her. Alara, the woman who was not supposed to be here. The woman who had rebuilt his ruin. Another violent gust of wind slammed against the house, and a loose shutter somewhere began to bang rhythmically against a stone wall. Thump! 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 Alistair flinched, the sound clearly of fresh torment. Alara acted without thinking. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid like iron. The contact was a shock to both of them. Through the fine wool of his coat, she could feel the violent tremors shaking his entire body. "That is a shutter," she said, her voice dropping to a lower, more grounding register. "A shutter on the north side of the house. I told Finch it needed to be repaired. He will see to it in the morning." She did not remove her hand. The simple, physical contact seemed to be the only thing holding him to the present. He stared at her hand on his arm. He stared at her face, her gray eyes, which were not cold or appraising now, but filled with a fierce, focused concentration. She was not afraid of him. She was not repulsed by his weakness. She was managing him. She was managing his broken mind with the same unyielding pragmatism she had used to manage his broken estate. Slowly, agonizingly, the tension began to leak out of him. The rigid lines of his body softened. His breathing, while still harsh, deepened. The ghosts were receding, pushed back not by strength or by comfort, but by the undeniable, mundane reality of a leaky roof and a loose shutter. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through him, a final, violent tremor. When he opened them again, the wild terror was gone, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. He was back. He was in the library. He was on the floor, a mess of spilled oil and shattered composure at the feet of the wife he had abandoned. He looked down at her hand, still resting on his arm. It was a small, capable hand, with calluses on the palm that he hadn't noticed before. It was an anchor. It was the only solid thing in a world that had just dissolved into chaos. "Alara," he whispered, the name a foreign sound on his own lips. And then he did something he had not done in the presence of another living soul since he was a boy. He bowed his head, leaned forward, and rested his forehead against her shoulder, utterly, completely, and humiliatingly defeated. The storm raged on outside, but inside the library, in the circle of firelight, a different kind of quiet fell. Alara did not move. She let him stay there, this great, broken man, his head resting on her shoulder, the weight of him both a burden and a strange, unexpected comfort. She could feel the last of the tremors subside, replaced by the deep, shuddering breaths of pure exhaustion. His defenses had not just been breached, they had been annihilated. The haunted Duke, the cold and ruthless politician, the man who had left her to die without a backward glance, had crumbled to dust, and in his place was this vulnerable, traumatized man. After a long time, he stirred, lifting his head. The shame radiating from him was a palpable force. He pushed himself up, moving away from her as if her touch now burned him. He could not meet her eyes. He got to his feet, swaying slightly, and stood with his back to her, staring into the fire. "I apologize," he said, his voice a hoarse, ragged thing. "You should not have had to witness that." Alara rose slowly, her own limbs stiff. She looked at his broad, rigid back, the picture of embattled pride. The expected response, the socially acceptable response, would be to murmur some soothing platitude. "It's quite all right. Your Grace, think nothing of it." But Alara had long since abandoned the language of polite society. It was a currency that had no value here at Blackwood. "Witness what precisely?" she asked, her tone practical. "A man haunted by the war he was forced to fight? I have read the histories, Your Grace. I know where you were and when. It would be more surprising if you were not haunted." He flinched, but did not turn. "It is not something to be discussed." "Perhaps that is the problem," she said quietly. She moved to the side of the fireplace, so he would not have to turn fully to see her. She began to tidy the mess he had made, picking up the fallen book, righting the overturned table. Simple, practical actions. You have been carrying this alone for a very long time. He finally looked at her, his eyes shadowed with a misery so profound it stole her breath. There is no one else to carry it. That is no longer true, she said simply. It was not a declaration of love or affection. It was a statement of fact, as clear and solid as the numbers in her ledgers. We are a partnership. Your liabilities are now my liabilities. He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the anger and the pain. She saw a flicker of desperate, unwilling hope. The hope of a drowning man who, after years of struggling alone in a cold sea, feels the unexpected touch of a solid shore. She broke the intensity of the moment by turning away. You are exhausted, and you are cold. She went to the decanter of brandy that sat on a side table. She poured a generous measure into a glass, her hand perfectly steady, and held it out to him. Drink this. It was an order, not a suggestion. He took the glass, his fingers brushing against hers. His hand was freezing cold. He drank the brandy in one long swallow, the liquor hitting his system like a controlled explosion, burning away the last vestiges of the hallucinatory chill. I'm going to make some tea, she announced, heading for the door. And then I'm going to find you some blankets. You will not be returning to your room tonight. You will stay here by the fire. I don't need a nursemaid, he bit out, the reflex of pride still strong. She paused at the door and looked back at him. No, she agreed. You do not. You need an ally. There is a difference. Now, do you prefer your tea with sugar or without? The question was so absurd, so mundane, in the face of the cataclysm that had just occurred, that it shattered the last of his resistance. A short, harsh sound escaped his lips. It was not a laugh, not quite, but it was the closest thing to it she had ever heard from him. Without, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded and left, leaving him alone in the quiet, firelit room. He sank into the wingback chair, the empty brandy glass held loosely in his hand. He felt scoured, emptied, as if some great, festering wound had been lanced and drained. The shame was still there, a bitter coating on his tongue, but it was mingled with something else. A profound, bone-deep weariness, yes, but also a sliver of something that felt terrifyingly like relief. She had not run. She had not screamed. She had not recoiled in horror or pity. She had faced his demons with him, armed not with sentiment, but with facts. She had anchored him to reality with the sheer, unyielding force of her pragmatism. She had seen the very worst of him, the broken, terrified creature hidden beneath the ducal armor, and she had made him tea. When she returned, she was carrying a tray. On it was a steaming teapot, 2 cups, and a plate of the simple, oaten biscuits she favored. She was followed by Mary, the young maid, who carried a thick pile of woolen blankets and a pillow. Mary, who was clearly terrified of him, darted a wide-eyed glance in his direction, deposited the blankets on the chaise longue, and fled without a word. Alara set the tray down on the table between them. She poured the tea, her movements calm and efficient. She passed him a cup. Their fingers brushed again, and this time he did not pull away. The silence that fell between them was different now. The tension was gone. It was no longer a weapon, but a space to breathe. They drank their tea without speaking. The storm outside was beginning to abate, the wind's shriek softening to a mournful sigh, the rain lessening to a steady drumming. In the quiet of the library, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the gentle clink of a cup on a saucer. After he had finished his tea, Alara spoke. There is a leak, she said, her voice conversational. In the roof of the main hall. The storm has found a new weakness. It will need to be addressed tomorrow. He looked at her, understanding what she was doing. She was rebuilding the world, one practical problem at a time. She was giving him a task, a tangible thing to focus on, a way to move from the chaos of the past to the reality of the present. I know something of roofs, he said, the words feeling rusty in his mouth. He had overseen the construction of fortifications, of redoubts and battlements. A leaky roof was a problem he could, at least, comprehend. "Good," she said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. "Finch is an excellent groundsman, but he is afraid of heights. You can assist him." She was giving him a job, not as a duke, but as a man with a strong back and a knowledge of structures. It was a demotion and a promotion all at once. He was no longer the spectral landlord. He was being offered a position on the staff. "I will," he said, and with those two words, a truce was signed. The Cold War was over. An alliance, fragile and untested, had just been formed. The next morning, Alistair woke on the chaise longue in the library, stiff and sore, but clear-headed. The storm had passed, and a weak, watery sunlight was filtering through the windows. The fire had been banked, and a fresh pot of tea sat waiting on the hearth, still warm. She had been there while he slept. The thought sent a strange, unfamiliar warmth through him. True to her word, and his, they spent the day on the roof. Alara directed the operation from the ground, a general commanding her troops, while Alistair and a reluctant Finch climbed the ladders. He stripped off his ducal coat, rolled up his sleeves, and worked. He hauled buckets of tar, replaced slipped slates, and hammered new lead flashing into place. The physical labor was a balm to his soul. It was hard, honest work with a clear and immediate result. By dusk, the leak was mended. Standing on the roof, looking out over the valley as the sun set, Alistair felt a sense of accomplishment that none of his political victories had ever given him. He was tired, his muscles ached, and he was covered in tar, but he had fixed something that was broken. That evening, after a dinner eaten in a comfortable, rather than strained, silence, Alara did not immediately go to her ledgers. Instead, she brought a second chair over to the Duke's desk. "I have a problem," she said, pushing one of the large account books towards him. "A legal one. It concerns the eastern pastures. The lease agreement your grandfather signed is ambiguous. A neighboring landlord, Sir Hugo Carmichael, is claiming grazing rights that I believe are unfounded. He is belligerent." Alistair looked at the book, then at her. She was not just asking for his help. She was admitting a limit to her own expertise. She was ceding a small piece of her hard-won territory. It was a profound gesture of trust. He pulled the book closer. "Carmichael," he said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "I know the man. He is a grasping, opportunistic fool. Let me see the lease." For the next 3 hours, they worked together. She, with her intimate knowledge of the estate's practicalities and finances, and he, with his legal training and his ruthless understanding of men like Carmichael. Their minds, so different, meshed with a surprising and powerful efficiency. He dictated a letter to Carmichael, a masterpiece of veiled threats and legalistic intimidation, and she transcribed it in her neat, precise hand. When they were finished, a new kind of quiet settled over the room. It was the quiet of a team that has just successfully completed a difficult task. "We make a formidable pair, you and I," he murmured, looking at the letter. "We are a solvent enterprise," she corrected, but there was a warmth in her eyes that belied the dry, businesslike term. In that moment, leaning together over the desk, the firelight warming their faces, the house silent and secure around them, they were not a duke and his inconvenient wife. They were a partnership. They were the joint proprietors of Blackwood, a small, fierce, and entirely defensible kingdom they had forged together out of ruins. The call from the old world arrived, as it always did, without warning. A royal courier, his horse lathered and his uniform spattered with the mud of a hard ride from London, appeared at Blackwood in the middle of a calm, cold November afternoon. He carried an urgent dispatch, sealed with the crest of the king's most senior minister. Alistair and Alara were in the newly cleared West Garden, planning the layout for a small orchard of hardy apple trees. He was holding a length of twine, while she was driving stakes into the frosty ground, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply satisfying. They had fallen into an easy rhythm in the weeks since the storm, a quiet partnership that played out in shared meals, joint sessions with the ledgers, and long walks across the estate where they discussed drainage and crop yields with the intensity of generals planning a campaign. He had not felt the icy grip of his ghosts once. The silence of Blackwood was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet, steady hum of a life being built. The arrival of the courier shattered that peace. The man's very presence, his crisp uniform and his air of London urgency, was an intrusion from a world Alastair had almost forgotten. He took the dispatch, the heavy vellum familiar and unwelcome in his hand. He recognized the seal, the spiky, impatient handwriting of the address. It was a summons, a crisis in the cabinet, a factional dispute that threatened to topple the government, a problem that, apparently, only the Duke of Blackwood, with his reputation for ruthless efficiency, could solve. He looked at Alara. He saw her watch the courier, her eyes going from the official seal on the letter to Alastair's face. And he saw the change happen. It was as if a light was extinguished behind her eyes. The easy warmth of their partnership vanished, replaced by a cool, formal distance. The wall she had so carefully dismantled went back up, stone by painful stone. She straightened up, brushing the dirt from her hands, an unconscious gesture of tidying herself, of preparing for a formal departure. Her face became a smooth, impenetrable mask. The pragmatic survivor was back in command, pushing the contented partner into the background. "You will be needing to pack, Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice she had used on him when he first arrived, the voice of a subordinate addressing a superior. "I will have Mrs. Croft see to your things. How long will you be in London? I will need to adjust the household budget accordingly." The words were like a series of slaps. She was not asking if he was going. She was not asking what the letter contained. She was assuming. She was assuming that this world they had started to build together was a temporary idyll, a brief respite before his real life reclaimed him. She was assuming he would leave. And the worst part was, a month ago, she would have been right. He would have left without a second thought. Duty, the title, the endless, grinding machine of politics, that was his life. Blackwood was just an interlude. But it wasn't anymore. He looked from her closed, guarded face to the dispatch in his hand. The seal represented everything he had once been, a man of power and influence, a player in the great game. It represented his duty to the crown, to his name, to the world that had shaped and nearly broken him. And he realized, with a clarity that was as sudden and profound as the terror he'd felt during the storm, that he felt nothing. No pull, no sense of obligation. Only a vast, weary distaste. That world of smoke and mirrors, of betrayal and hollow victories, was not his world anymore. His world was here. It was the feel of cold earth under his fingernails, the smell of wood smoke, the satisfying heft of a balanced ledger. His world was the fierce, intelligent, and infuriatingly practical woman standing before him, who had rebuilt his house and, in the process, had unknowingly started to rebuild him. "Alastair," she said, and the use of his given name, a slip of the tongue from their recent intimacy, was laced with a pain she was trying desperately to hide. "The courier is waiting for your reply." He looked at the courier, a young man with an earnest, impatient face, a ghost from a life he no longer wanted to lead. He looked at the dispatch in his hand. Then he looked back at Alara, at her pale, proud face and the hurt she was trying so valiantly to conceal behind a mask of cold efficiency. He knew, in that moment, that this was the most important battle he would ever fight. Not in Parliament, not on a field in Spain, but here, in a half-planted garden, with a piece of paper. He did not say a word. He turned and walked, not towards the house to pack, but towards the small, crackling bonfire Finch had lit to burn the garden waste. The courier watched him, confused. Alara watched him, her expression frozen. He stopped before the fire. He held the dispatch for a moment, the summons from the king's minister, the call of duty, the voice of his old life. He looked at the wax seal, the symbol of his power and his servitude. And then, with a calm, deliberate movement, he tossed it into the flames. The vellum curled instantly, the edges blackening. The red wax of the seal melted, bubbling like a drop of blood before being consumed by the fire. The paper caught, flaring up in a bright, brief flash of light. And then it was gone, reduced to a wisp of gray ash that drifted up into the cold November sky. He turned back to face them. He looked at the stunned courier. "There is no reply," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with an absolute finality. "You may tell the minister that the Duke of Blackwood is indisposed. Permanently." The courier, his mouth agape, simply stared, unable to process the sheer, monumental act of rebellion he had just witnessed. A duke did not simply burn a royal dispatch. It was not done. Alistair paid him no more mind. His gaze was fixed on Alara. She stood motionless, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her mask of composure had finally cracked. Her lips were parted in disbelief, her gray eyes wide and luminous with unshed tears. She looked at the ashes of the dispatch, then at him, the question clear in her eyes. "Why?" He walked towards her, closing the distance between them. He stopped just before her, close enough to feel the warmth of her breath. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently wipe the smudge of dirt from her cheek with his thumb. "My duty is no longer in London," he said, his voice low and raw with an emotion he was only just beginning to understand. "It was never there. I was just too blind to see it." He looked around them, at the half-finished orchard, at the solid, smoking chimneys of the house, at the stark, beautiful landscape that had become his sanctuary. "This is my home now," he said, his eyes locking with hers, willing her to believe him, to understand the truth that had just become so blindingly clear to him. He took her cold, calloused hand in his. "You're my home, Alara." It was not a poet's declaration. It was a statement of fact, as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. It was the final balanced entry in the ledger of his life. And at those words, the last of her defenses crumbled. The pragmatic survivor, the fierce warrior who had conquered a ruin and a duke's neglect, finally surrendered. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, followed by another. She did not sob or weep, but the silent tears were more eloquent than any storm of emotion. They were the melting of a frozen, guarded heart. She leaned forward, her body trembling, and rested her forehead against his chest, right over his heart. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head. She felt impossibly small and fragile in his arms, and yet he knew she was the strongest person he had ever met. They stood there for a long time, entwined in the middle of their unfinished garden, while the forgotten courier quietly mounted his horse and rode away, carrying with him a story no one in London would ever believe. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. A cold wind was picking up, heralding the coming winter. But for the first time, Alistair did not dread the cold or the darkness. He held his wife, his partner, his home, in his arms. They were two broken pieces that, against all odds, had found a way to fit together. They were not a grand romance. They were a small, fiercely protected fortress, a solvent enterprise, a partnership built on a foundation of shared struggle and mutual respect. In the heart of their reclaimed kingdom, surrounded by the quiet hum of the life they had built, they stood as one, a permanent fixture against the coming night, fiercely alive and completely whole.